we're now moving into the next day and a half, the next part of the program, in which we're going to begin to think together about how to translate all of this powerful knowledge and powerful ideas and powerful concepts about society and governance and kids into our practice as journalists. One of the hardest parts of that is simply to think about how to communicate science. Some of you in here are science reporters. Most of us are reporters who are in other fields, but who have to integrate scientific knowledge into work. So this first conversation is going to be about, well, as you can see, achievements to date and future directions in communicating the science of early childhood development, with Yoshikawa. As I said at the beginning, Elana Newman has been the champion of building bridges between clinicians and researchers and journalists on a wide variety of trauma and resilience-related issues. So she's going to lead this conversation, and Elana, take it from there.
So as Bruce said, we really are pivoting now to starting to talk about craft, and we've been hearing a lot about policies, we've been hearing a lot about science. And I'm really excited because our next speaker really brings all of this together, which is he's evaluated practically every program or is in the process of evaluating many of the programs we've been talking about, and we've heard little bits and pieces about, and really integrating the science as we move in starting to think about the journalistic craft issues, which is how are you all going to communicate the science and distill it down in telling the stories that you want to tell about young children. So I'm really delighted to introduce Yoshikawa, okay, I got it right, who is the Courtney Sale Professor of Globalization and Education at NYU, and pretty much at NYU contributes to a lot of the programs that have to do with young kids. And he is basically, he's trained as a community and developmental psychologist, but he studies the effects of public policies and programs related to early childhood, as well as some immigration and poverty issues. And he conducts research all over the world, in the US, and in many of the places that you are all from. He's leading the research and evaluation for the MacArthur Foundation 100 and Change funded partnership, so the Sesame Street program that we heard just a little bit about, and I hope we get to hear a little bit more about. The Syrian Refugee International Rescue Committee programming there. The cash transfer program we heard about. He's the person who's doing the evaluation of that program that we started to hear about. So this is really how do we start thinking about and communicating all that we've learned. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin and guide us.
Thanks so much. All of these things are done in large teams. I'm not really leading anything. I just feel like, and working with some folks in this room, like Marta, on the Sesame and IRC home visiting part of that project. But I was going to, well, this is one frame that I think is really guiding this whole meeting that I just wanted to share from the Nurturing Care Framework, which is the new UNICEF WHO approach to thinking about how to promote nurturing care during the first 1,000 days. And it is about stories and storytelling. But I wanted to say, start with kind of what are strategies in communication that I've found have been kind of interesting to be around, and three kind of initiatives that I've had the really the kind of the luck of being in the right place and the right time to have participated in. One is in the work of the Harvard Center on the Developing Child on building kind of a core story of early childhood development, which I know Chuck Nelson integrated, I'm sure, into his presentation. But what I feel as at that point on the faculty at the Harvard Education School and participating with the communications firm, the Frameworks Institute, what were some of the lessons there? The second was how the global ECD community came together to build a case for integrating early childhood development beyond survival into the Sustainable Development Goals. And then the third was kind of selling the idea of within a big complicated competition of how to address ECD in humanitarian contexts and how that case was made. But then I wanted to move to where, maybe shouldn't say we failed, but where the field has not actually addressed communication, which is really at the challenges of what policymakers face in trying to implement ECD policies at national scale. So I'm going to quickly go through 3 cases, just highlighting briefly what I saw as kind of positive strategies that look like they were effective in communicating the science of ECD, much of which you've heard over the last day and a half, to the public and to policymakers, those 2 critical primary audiences. So the Harvard Center, which, as I think probably all of you know, Jack Shonkoff has directed since 2006, spent about the first 5 years of that center's existence on what we called building a core story of early childhood development. So turning this mass of neuroscience and economics and evaluation studies into a set of core messages. And those have informed all the work of the communications of the center since then, and I think have been enormously influential to the field. And so some of these phrases, how many of you have heard before this meeting the phrase brain architecture to describe early childhood development? Yeah, so, and how many of you have heard the phrase toxic stress before yesterday? Okay, so yeah, the vast majority of you. So these phrases have kind of gotten into the bloodstream at national and global levels, but I think there's actually a couple things that lie behind how that happened that are interesting. One of which is that 2 kinds of research came together. So the kind of research that Chuck Nelson does, and the basic science and neuroscience and Kim Noble and folks like that. But there was actually a communications research firm called the Frameworks Institute that built a long-term partnership with the center, and it's still going on. So as of now, it's about an 11 or 12-year partnership between the Frameworks Institute, which is located in Washington, D.C. Their mission is to bring the science in various areas of hard sciences or social sciences to policymakers by boiling the science down into digestible frames, which are kind of like schemas or implicit messages that counter the usual public perception of an issue. The idea is that good science should be providing something new beyond the kinds of assumptions and folk ideas that people have around a particular issue. So one, just to give a common assumption, for example, and this is from kind of United States communications research, there is this sense that really the family is all that matters for early childhood development. Parents are really the only influence, and so the government really has no business kind of in families' lives. And all of child development happens within this kind of family bubble. And so there aren't other contexts that should be considered as part of policy. And there are other assumptions that we could talk about. But what the Frameworks Institute does is to bring a variety of qualitative methods of national public opinion polls and randomized experiments, testing different frames and approaches to messaging different aspects of the science of child development, and brings all of that research to bear onto every product that the center produces. There is not a single word that comes out of that center's publications that doesn't go through some oversight and or research by the Frameworks Institute. So this was one interesting aspect of that partnership. The qualitative data, the interviews of people on the street, which they do nationally, the public opinion polls, they tend to identify and surface what some of the assumptions are behind notions like resilience or adversity and stress, or the role of government or of families or of neighborhoods and communities in child development. And then at the end of that process, they come up with what they call simplifying metaphors, which are often kind of images, but we think of brain architecture as being one, toxic stress is another, that are simple, easy to remember, but don't reflect just a single concept, but almost always a process. And this was something that was, for me, very interesting to learn. And the phrases were chosen to then be able to very easily attach a visual of a process of development or change. And so brain architecture, for example, implies that a house is built. And so all the other phrases that went with it, which were the foundations of the brain, are built in early childhood. You've heard these. And so the images that you see then in the short animations, and I don't have time to show you the animations, but you can just go on their website. You've probably seen some of these. They were 1-minute videos, basically. You actually see a blueprint and a house being built and a picture of an infant and an infant's brain, much like what Kim Noble, I think, showed you yesterday, right? So there's a sense that instead of a brain just kind of emerging miraculously at the end of, at age 3 or something like that, that there is actually a process, and that a house has to be built on strong foundations. So that was part of the core story of early childhood development, is that if you don't have a strong foundation, and the entire rest of the house is threatened. So that went into the choice of brain architecture compared to other metaphors. Toxic stress, I would say, kind of ran away with, I think it's been used and perhaps kind of misused in a variety of ways. I feel like in these days when I talk to reporters, I always say that toxic stress is not a death sentence. There is this process of resilience, that not all children react to exactly the same stressful event in the same way. But at the same time, we do have to acknowledge that certain kinds of experiences, like prolonged experience to war and conflict, to separation, forced separation from parents, as has been all over the news and the policies of the current administration in the United States. Some of these things are likely to produce a kind of stress response in children that represents a toxic stress response, which I'm sure Chuck talked about yesterday. Another example is that to take the notion of resilience, they used a metaphor of a seesaw, which also again implies motion and the fact that positive and negative influences on child development might change over time, and you want to kind of look at the balance. So you see, again, this is like a motion metaphor. It's not something that is static. And that's because child development is such a dynamic process. It is this continual interaction, right, between the environment and the brain, the physical, the socio-emotional, the cognitive capacities of the child in the context of the caregivers. So there's a communications science aspect to what frameworks brought, but then there was this group that was a group of scientists that was convened in a kind of, in the US context, this came out of a National Academy of Sciences process, but this idea of you do need an interdisciplinary group of some of the top basic science researchers, but also some of the evaluation scientists and applied researchers of development. And so I served on the policy and program subgroup of that group, but Chuck Nelson, for example, has been on that group for a long time. So that group really holds the communication science to the standard of, is this true to the current research, or is this distorting the current research? So it's the communication between these two organizations that has proven successful, not just in the US, but in a similar initiative in Brazil. And so I think this model of how communication scientists can work with interdisciplinary groups of psychologists, neuroscientists, economists, the folks who are doing the science of early childhood development can be useful. The second case is about how we link ECD to the broader sustainable development agenda. And this was something that was actually an initiative based at Columbia University, chaired by Jeffrey Sachs, played a particular role of bringing research from outside the UN system into a very complicated process of negotiating the wording and the content of the 2015 to 2030 Sustainable Development Goal. So as some of you may be aware, the prior version of the goals, the Millennium Development Goals, had infant and maternal mortality and reducing those as goals, but really not early learning and early development beyond survival. So what Jeff did was to assemble kind of a network of research and technical experts in what he thought at that point, this is in about 2012 and 13, would be 12 areas of likely goals. Of course, we ended up with 17, so the number was a little bit of an underestimate. So committees were created in each of these areas of goals to bring the current consensus across research as well as civil society and what was known by the technical experts in that area to develop brief wording and then measurable, quantifiable proposed indicators for the UN system. In this case, the area of education. So I served on the Education and ECD and Transition to Adulthood Committee, which ended up being the content area of SDG 4. But what was really important was the bringing together, again, of a scientific consensus, but then building and creating advocates who would be willing to speak up in the UN process. And that was often at the country level, and they were country leaders, and they were often not like who we thought they might be. So they were not, for example, ministers of education. They were often the ambassadors who were representing the country's ambassadors to the UN, who were representing this process in the overall sets of committees working on the SDGs. What we found was that all of those frames, the neuroscience, the economics, which we had assumed was well known, was not at all well known within those communities. So if you think of the folks who were working on all of these different areas of goals, of course, no one's an expert in everything. So our challenge was also, how do we link something as kind of potentially marginalized as young children to the larger, very broad goals of societal development. And so we had to come up with language like this that, you know, really, if you don't have a next generation that is educated and qualified, there is going to be no one to be custodians of our planet. And so we had to link to the Sustainable Development Agenda. And so these are the kinds of arguments that we had to make. It's not that easy because young children feel very far from the adulthood. But I think taking this kind of life course and intergenerational perspective on who is going to be implementing the SDGs and then the next set of goals during this critical moment when the planet is at risk was the kind of argument that we made. And it's the human development argument within societal sustainable development. And so I think this continues to be a challenge. I'm so glad the session before, which was about kind of implicitly linking the urban goal of goal 11 to goal 4.2 is extremely important, and that urban planning does have to consider the experiences of youth and children, whether you are in a crowded urban settlement with inadequate sanitation or in Morningside Park. So ultimately, this was the language of 4.2, and I'm not going to go over that. The third case was linking two sectors that really haven't been linked until quite recently, and that is the humanitarian sector and the massive increase in refugees worldwide, unprecedented millions, with early childhood development. And I would say this is another version of this idea of arguing for ECD that is beyond survival. Because the humanitarian sector rightly focuses on health and nutrition and survival. The very first thing that a government tries to do is to save lives. Certain parts of a government, of course, is politically very complicated, and the point at which governments or the UN system gets involved is its whole geopolitical process. But then when there are those first responders and NGOs coming in, or the UNHCR, for a whole variety of reasons, the health and nutrition, basic survival things are the first thing that they pay attention to. And that means that, again, ECD beyond survival tends to get lost. And so I've been part of a initiative that the MacArthur Foundation funded about 7 months ago called 100 and Change. And this is the partnership that Elana was mentioning between Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee. And it is a overall $100 million project to provide ECD programming to Syrian refugees in 4 Middle Eastern countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. And the project involves providing home-based services that get at some of this nurturing care and parenting, center-based early learning programs that could be in the childcare kind of idea or more of a formal preschool kind of setting, and then a whole new Sesame Street program that will be designed and tailored for the situation of Syrian refugees with young kids and their host communities in each of these countries. So this was a very large competition, and a lot of thought went into how to communicate the necessity of this solution among the 1,900 applications and solutions that were proposed for this single award. The MacArthur Foundation decided to only give one award at that level instead of whatever, a smaller size of award or more awards, and we could all argue with that approach or whatever. But in any case, we had to make the case, and our core case, of course, was this beyond survival, children have a right to thrive, and therefore frame early childhood development as an improvement on the humanitarian sector. We brought the funding numbers into it. If you look at overall humanitarian aid funding, only 2% goes to education worldwide, and only a tiny fraction of that goes to early childhood development services of these kinds of either home center or mass media types. Then we made the argument that there were three things that all children need, and this is, I think, very much along the lines of the Bernard Van Leer kind of messaging, but that these children were most likely to lack because of their exposure to war, conflict, violence, and adversity. And those were nurturing care on the part of their caregivers. Many of these kids, of course, have actually lost their primary caregivers. Stability and reestablishing stability through a comforting routine. And we talked about some of the important aspects of that, like just everyday aspects, like someone in your childcare setting knowing your name, or in preschool, or that kind of thing. And the importance of learning through play. The selling of the project also included telling stories of individual kids who've lived through war and parental loss, and the kinds of effects that that may have had on their well-being. So telling a story of a particular child in Jordan in a refugee camp, for example, who had lost both parents and was living with an uncle. And so the kind of journalistic storytelling was brought into it. And then, of course, the kind of secret ingredient of our proposal, which was Muppets. And this wasn't a purely US-based thing. There have been multiple Middle Eastern Sesame Street productions, one in Jordan, one in the Gulf countries. There's been an Israeli-Palestinian show over the last 20, 25 years, so it is an organization that has a lot of that experience. And so a Muppet was brought on stage during the finalist presentation, and so this was this blending of the fact that, you know, literally learning through play, some humor, some entertainment blended with learning. And then finally, a call to action that the board could make a huge difference in what was largely a non-existent area by building the largest early childhood intervention in the history of humanitarian response. So those are, I think, some of the approaches to blending a communication science with journalistic storytelling, with this notion of what are the frames and the most effective frames for conveying the science of early childhood development. But I still think those experiences have left some gaps. And I think the biggest gap is that we don't know how to tell a story to policymakers and to the public that could inform, for example, municipal or national campaigns about how to bring these services to scale with quality and with the impacts that we know that kids deserve. So I would say that there's a whole core story that is missing in early childhood development, which is really how to go from whether we should invest in early childhood development. And we know that there have been massive increases in that with you know, upwards of 80, 90, 100 countries with national ECD legislation. But that's only the very first step. The idea of actually implementing services and sustaining those with governance and finance systems is, I think, a bigger challenge, because we think of early childhood and we think of young kids and we think of, you know, cute individuals. We don't think of systems, and we don't think of national policies. And yet, I think there's lessons that have been learned from the collective efforts of many countries over the last 50 years in how to build the case not only of whether to invest in ECD programs, but then how to. And I think we're starting to see some examples of where, for example, governments are starting to focus on quality, not just access. So how do you tell that story, and how do you tell that story in a way that can be compelling and adds those storytelling aspects to these kinds of larger macro issues. We know that an inclusive stakeholder process matters for both the creation of ECD policy and the creation of national action plans to implement those policies. We know that there are certain features of what we view as comprehensive ECD policies that are multi-sectoral, that involve coordination. You've heard about this over the last day and a half, that aren't just about the first 1,000 days, but the next 2,000 days, so that we really cover the whole age span of early childhood development, and that are addressing the real challenge of this field, which is that the services can't be the same for a 6-month-old and a 4.5-year-old, right? And so you need a developmentally sequenced set of policies and programs that often calls on multiple ministries and agencies. And you have to have some kind of professional development, workforce development approach to building quality and equity into the system. That's not that exciting a story, maybe, but it's the next set of stories that need to be told, and the idea of building the excitement of how do you build a quality program at national scale. And do we have examples from countries around the world where your country can learn? Whether they're neighboring countries in that region, and maybe it is your country, of the two kinds of scale that I think are required, which are first, this kind of small to bigger kind of scale, a pilot or a demonstration program, going to national scale gradually, or what we sometimes call a big to better kind of scale, which is there's a system that's already at scale. Let's say it's the community health worker workforce. How do you build ECD into the work that they're doing across a country? So there's both these kind of scale issues in expanding small-scale programs, but also improving large-scale systems to provide ECD. So one idea might be that instead of this idea of communicating the work of basic scientists to policymakers, maybe we need to communicate policy to science and kind of turn this a little bit backwards, which is we know that there are public preferences and policymaker preferences that underlie ECD. And just to give some common ones, there is some preference or expectation that pre-primary education, for example, should look like primary education. We see this in many countries, I would say, in many regions around the world, which is a little unfortunate because the problems with quality in primary education just get then reproduced in pre-primary education. And that's actually part of what happened with the MDGs. There was a massive failure, huge increases in access, and very little increase in learning in far too many countries around the world. And that's because quality wasn't paid attention to. And so it was access over quality, right? So we tend to often see then some of the failures of primary education reproduced in pre-primary education. Sometimes we see the preference for only English rather than a home language in instruction in some countries around the world, and again, taught in a rote kind of way. Policy preferences are often for low-cost and low-intensity interventions. That makes a lot of sense, but might not be right all the time. In different countries, policymakers might prefer targeted approaches versus universal approaches, and I would argue ECD requires some of both, but for different kinds of outcomes and for different levels of need and stress and adversity. There are, of course, preferences for immediate results over long-term investments. And how do you tell this story about the long-term investments when administrations are several years, and then a typical tenure of a minister of, say, education might be like 18 months, as I think is the average in Latin America. So these are, I think, some of the challenges and some of the assumptions at the policy level, at the level of the public, that we need to kind of try to address, both in journalism and in communicating the science of policy implementation and evaluation in ECD. And I think we need to build simplifying metaphors for national action, and I think we need to learn from the marketing of successful national policies, like Chile Crece Contigo or De Cero a Siempre, which are the national ECD policies of Chile and Colombia. that have used social mobilization, techniques like building communication strategies for multiple political parties, building bridges between NGO and civil society, and of course recruiting champions who are kind of, public opinion leaders in building a case for not just whether to invest in ECD, but exactly how to invest. So I think there are then moving to what are the techniques that you all might use. I think visuals and animation to represent systems and policy levers are important. This prior session on the built environment made me think that in the New York Times there's a new virtual reality set of stories where you see in 360 degrees an environment, and so that would be something that's perfectly suited to something like the lessons of the last session. So I think there's a lot to use around new technologies in journalism to represent what, after all, is a process, whether it's an individual level process of development or a governance or a national level process of implementation. How do we build the simplifying metaphors for certain principles in implementation, right? So building diversity into an inclusion into a national policy. How do we kind of make that into a metaphor that everyone can understand? How do we build in the notion that data can inform quality improvement? Can we build metaphors that are as effective as brain architecture or toxic stress for some of these notions? I don't know. But I think it would be great if folks were working on that. There is a separate science of when do programs work and when do programs not work, and can we draw those lessons? Can those be effective stories and lessons for implementation? And finally, I think the journalist's role is to tell stories, and the challenge here, I think, is to bridge individual stories of children and families with national policy. And I think there are some examples, and unfortunately, I'm kind of more limited to my knowledge of the US journalistic landscape. And so I think of books like Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers. That's not Beyond. Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which is kind of a stunning 3-year long-form ethnographic journalism account of a particular urban settlement in Mumbai. Or Jason DeParle's masterful book, which told the story of 10 families, but an entire policy change, a history of policy change in the area of social protection in the United States through the lens of 10 families, and then going back and forth between that and national policy change and the actors who led welfare reform in the United States. So I think right now we're seeing a lot of journalistic effort around ECD in the humanitarian sector in the United States with some of these kind of parent-child separation issues. But I think short-term versus longer-term projects are both needed. So to conclude, I think we've achieved enormous impact in the science of ECD around this issue of convincing governments and policymakers to invest rather than not invest in ECD, and now it's all about the how. I think we are getting increasing attention to ECD in the humanitarian sector, but I think this application to national level implementation and scale has not been figured out from a communications perspective. So I look forward to your thoughts and questions about facing these challenges and or any of those case studies that I talked about before.
Okay, I'm going to start. Thank you so much. And I think this notion that there's a science to metaphors, but this whole notion of what metaphors can you as journalists use without distorting facts, that makes sense in your context. And I was struck by the fact that the messaging was very American, and I don't know how it translates, and just thinking about how can you tell stories, what metaphors work for you. The other thing that struck me as you were talking is that the field of early child development really has moved forward by linking to other fields. And I guess when I thought about that journalistically, how can you link a story about a young child to any beat you cover? How can you take that approach for whatever the stories are in your community, in your place, and how do you take that child perspective and put that into your storytelling? And so it really struck me as you were speaking that might be a really helpful way to think about things. There's a lot that hasn't been said, and I want to take us down one level because you have such expertise in these evaluations and evaluating these programs and how they scale up. What are the kinds of things that journalists should pay attention to when they're talking to programs or to scientists about effective programs as they start to think about scaling up? What's the science? What's some tips you would give a journalist?
I think it's been useful in the global ECD, some of the kind of funding world, that there's been a shift towards thinking about the workforce and not just thinking about kids and families. So I think the notion of understanding the challenges that the workforce faces is an example of starting to bring the notion that there are systems and implementation issues at play, and that those folks have their own stories to tell about successes and challenges. They also often have their own exposure to the same kinds of stresses and adversity and poverty, because these are typically low-paid workforces, if they are paid at all. So I think bringing some of those stories, and those people can themselves tell you extraordinary stories about the work that they do. And so I think those are kind of the unsung heroes of the field. And to the extent that attention can be brought to the work conditions and the well-being of the workforce, that gets beyond some of these let's just show the kids kind of approach, which I think is the first step. But I think there should be some of that emphasis on the workforce. That's one way to bring a wider lens on it. And I like what you said about bringing an emphasis on kids in areas of development. And so I do think urban planning is a great example. So as there are public transportation innovations, how are those experienced by families with young kids? The challenges of the intersection of work schedules when parents have infants and toddlers with transportation systems, for example, is one example, I think.
It was very interesting for me to hear about sort of what went into the marketing of your message and all of the care taken to use specific language, because journalists often fight against that kind of very specific messaging. So from the perspective of policymakers or even scientists, what you guys might call metaphors, we might call jargon. and we're often trying to get past that wall of what you've, you as a scientific community have already figured out is what you want to get out. But a lot of times our challenge is to get past that and to really make sure that the information and the language that we get is very natural and goes kind of beyond what the kind of the marketing message is. So I'm just curious, when like the Center for the Developing Child comes up with very specific, we want to talk about it in this way, we want to make sure these are the words that get out there, how flexible are you sort of told to be, or are you prepared to be when journalists come and say, well, can we get past that wall,
Yeah, I mean, I think one example is that the group of basic scientists that came up with the phrase toxic stress realized that that could be perceived in a limited kind of way, which doesn't actually include part of the physiological process that's the response of the child or the caregiver, right? So I think one way is to kind of make sure that there is some notion that that's a response, and that varies by individual. It's not like a particular event is by definition toxic or not. So that's just an example of how I think what happened in that case is this two-word phrase got distributed so widely and then got interpreted in so many ways. It was successful more than it was expected to be. So we see that phrase coming up in, very wide journalistic and other contexts. And so I think then the challenge is, how do you go back and try to make it truer to the science while retaining in some ways, I guess, the simplicity and the power of the language. But I'm not sure whether that answers your question. But the
Well, I mean,
the idea of a simplifying metaphor is to actually not use jargon, right? So brain architecture is two words that are neither of which are jargony.
although a journalist would say, well, I understand what you're saying, but maybe our readers want to know more behind that. What does that really mean? And sometimes, I mean, I'm not referring to the Center for the Developing Child per se, but a lot of different institutions, sometimes it's hard to get past that because they've been to all of these workshops about these are the languages you need, this is the language you need to use with journalists. And I'm like, but brain architecture isn't going to mean anything to listeners, so can you just explain in other language? And I mean, I don't know that this is a very specific question, but it is a bit of a back and forth, I think, sometimes, because you guys spend so much very thoughtful time figuring out how to create the message that you want, and then we journalists come and fight against that.
No, that's right. And I should say that these phrases were embedded within sequences of statements. So the brain architecture one was then followed up by the fact that this serve and return, or the nature of responsive interactions, is the engine that drives brain architecture. That development can get derailed in contexts of severe adversity. So there was kind of a sequence of statements that was designed to together tell this kind of core story of how early childhood development happens. But then I think it's been this greater struggle to talk about how contexts and policies matter, and how communities can make a difference and governments can make a difference, and what they can actually do. And that's where I just still feel like we don't have a kind of parallel set of messages around.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? In your discussions with the scientific board, was there anything you think that's important that was lost in the messaging science? Is there something that was a debate or something that was lost in this communication strategy? Was there debate about any
Well, I think
area?
there were certain themes that weren't actually addressed, and so I remember we had discussions about peer influences, for example. That's not anywhere in any of those messages, right? So there isn't, but we were discussing, if we think of the actual influences on early childhood development, yes, of course, it's kind of these responsive interactions with adults, but peers make an enormous difference in child development, right? I also think, and I think the center has gotten around to it, but I was pushing for adolescent development, for a parallel core story of adolescent development to be developed. And of course, this was a center that had limited capacity to, suddenly also add this huge area of youth development. But they have started to add the notion that there is plasticity of the brain during adolescence, and there are some additional critical or sensitive periods around the pubertal transition and the transition across adolescence that's very important for some of the same outcomes, like executive function skills, right? So I think there is a danger of going overboard with the first 1,000 days and X% of the brain being developed, which I think someone alluded to earlier today. But the fact that there is still plasticity, and then we depend on the skills of an adult workforce and adult skills. And so I think one of the areas where I think it was very productive for the center to move forward was to bring in this idea of adult capacities into the story. So at least you're talking about there's a set of skills for adults that actually also matters, no matter whether that adult is a parent or an older sibling or a caregiver in a childcare kind of setting, or a preschool teacher, or an early primary grade teacher, right? So all of these folks and their own skills and their own development, and in fact, adult development matters in those cases, because we need a skilled workforce in order to be able to implement these kinds of programs.
Sir, I'm Manish from India. Is there any template for communicating a successful ECD story? Why I'm asking is that it changes, it varies from country to country. What may be good for Brazil cannot be good for Bangladesh. At the same time, the way news was being delivered till yesterday, it's changing really very fast. Especially if you talk about all the policy makers. There will be a common refrain from India to America is that I don't get time to watch TV on, like news on TV, because the way people consume news is also changing very fast. because right now, even though we are not watching the World Cup football, but everybody is in this hall also is somewhere, glued to the score. So don't you think that, don't you think that we should also give a, thought to the whole process, the way traditional way of thinking, and in the time of social media, Facebook, like I'm telling you, I'm in television, but people don't say, like if I talk to them, they will say that, no, I saw your news clip on Facebook, I saw something on Twitter. Earlier it used to be till 3 years, 4 years back, it used to be, no, I saw your news on the prime time. So it's no more the same. So don't, and people for especially this kind of ECD kind of news, which is always what we used to call back of the paper or back of the channel.
Right.
People don't have the, attention, they don't have the time span to, go through that. So don't you think that, there is a time has come where you need to, change your strategy?
Yeah, so I was in Colombia on Thursday morning, and there were no meetings that morning because of the World Cup. That's neither here nor there. But yeah, no. So sorry, I skipped over some parts of the slides. One of which was that the field has produced some movies that some of you may have seen about ECD, which is great. There have been MOOCs and those kinds of things. I think the chunking of the messages into much shorter and snappy media that are designed for social media is something where the field probably just doesn't do that much. And yet we know that teenagers are watching certain things that go from like 0 to like millions of viewers within a few hours, right? So I agree. I think it's a challenge. It's the next challenge for the field. And as you say, it's the back of the paper. It's not, perhaps, when it makes the news, it's because a kid has died or there's there's often like kind of at the local news level, there's kind of a crisis. And then, that's when we sometimes hear about it. But I think there needs to be some way to actually make these messages both country specific and have local relevance. So I think the Brazil example was one in which a similar set of basic and evaluation scientists from around the country was brought together to start communicating their research within Brazil to Brazilian policymakers at the state level. So Brazil being a country as decentralized as India, the notion was that you had to bring in state legislators and state policy leaders in a group together regularly and try to build those relationships between the scientific community and the policy community. And I think a similar effort is something that we could think about in different countries. And that means building the capacity of the research and higher education institutions to go beyond what is often just kind of basic, maybe teacher training or those kinds of efforts, to building this kind of larger science of early childhood development, and then bringing those folks in contact with the media, in contact with policymakers at the country level. And so I think that's been a 7 or 8 year effort in Brazil that has produced some policy changes at the state level in that country.
I just wanted to add to that 0 to 3, which is an organization in the United States, has kind of taken a deep dive into another area, which we wouldn't call journalism, but they're working with script writers and trying to build in storylines about early childhood with characters into especially shows that teenagers watch, however they watch them. And so that's a way of messaging that's also going on, and also in some countries through the radio programs that kind of like telenovelas that are in the radio, building in messaging through characters.
Yeah. I also know that the Inter-American Development Bank has been doing some capacity building efforts for policymakers in Latin America. I don't know, Marta, whether you talked about that before, or do you want to say a little bit about that? Because I think it's important.
Hang on for the microphone.
But it's a MOOC that is thought for policymakers in the region. So I think it is all in Spanish, except for the extracts where experts are using English, which are subtitled or in their own language. But yes, the aim is to build capacity within in the region amongst policymakers thinking, and so it covers a lot of the same themes that we've been covering here: the neuroscience and the all of the brain architecture and the how to the institutional architecture in the countries and the needs for evaluation, and it goes through different examples of interventions that have worked and trying to simplify the research and trying to put it into the context of the countries. And it's been quite successful. I can't remember if it's I think it's on its 3rd edition already. And so, yeah, that's a resource that is available. If any of you is interested, email me and I'll direct you to the link. There's ongoing, I'm not sure it's always available. I think you have to join whenever there's a new round, because there's group work that is done as you go along the different sessions. But yeah, to get in touch if of interest. Thanks.
I find myself a little bit uncomfortable as a journalist advocate in this idea of messaging and journalism. And I don't know if I'm picking that up in the room, but I think this is one of the big questions in some ways, and it's something I think you were getting at as well, which is I am in great admiration of simplifying science so that it makes sense. But one of the things that I rely upon journalists to do is to ask the right questions. And there's sort of this area of what can we learn from this messaging area that applies to journalism, but where journalists are ascertaining the information instead of it sort of being top down in that way. And I just wonder about reactions either in the room or reactions here about that, because it's an interesting dilemma. On the one hand, this is much more accessible. On the other hand, it creates new questions for journalists to ask.
Yeah, I really wanted to follow up on what Karen said, because I feel like we sort of just touched the surface, but I covered Wall Street for 15 years, and there are literally like billion-dollar PR departments that spend their time messaging, which is basically spinning us, lying to us, misleading us, and I'm not accusing you of doing any of the above. I know frameworks very well, and I think the intent was really good, and I think it was translation, and science is really tricky. But I do think when you're talking about this script, I think probably everyone in the room is sort of like immediately going from this, been learning, almost like to a recoiling position of like, wait, I'm being scripted? I'm being told what? And I use these terms in my reporting quite a bit. And I think they run the risk of, after you've used toxic stress 3 times, it doesn't mean anything, and brain architecture a few times doesn't mean anything, and then we have to find the right language, which is actually, what are we saying? We're saying helping babies' brains to develop. That's what brain architecture is. So we can translate it. That can be part of our job. But I guess my hopefully constructive point is maybe in this next chapter, as you're thinking about what you need to do, maybe it's actually exactly the opposite of them. You created a script, and that got you to a point of, I think you've educated a lot of people, you've done a lot of really successful work building capacity support, whatever you want to call it, awareness. But maybe the next stage is much more tailoring and having just more authentic conversations about people and stories. And, when you're talking about the workforce, I thought that was a really helpful point. Like, oh yeah, that's a whole storyline. Help us find those people, but not through messaging and not through scripting, but through like, here's a person who works really hard, why don't you meet her? And then sort of helping us with the connection. But I did want to just follow up on what Karen said, because I absolutely understand the intent, but I feel like it also doesn't take into, it's not really considering what we're trying to do, which is not be messaged all the time, if that makes sense.
No, I mean, that's why I the second half was about where we failed, I think. And the examples I gave were the long form. Well, on the one hand, I think there's long form pieces, which are where you get to the real kind of, I would say, ethnographic kind of detail of really soaking in the lives of families and communities. And so those were the Catherine Boo and Jason DeParle examples. But I also think there are the pieces where, for example, I go to Vox.com for particular analyses of yesterday, I think Kim Noble talked about the basic income idea, so unconditional cash transfers, and there was like the best piece I've ever read about it in plain English, but was still long. It was still, it was more than a typical piece, so it was like, I don't know what you call it. It's somewhere between, maybe it was about 2,000 words, but it took you through the major international examples of basic income research, how it might affect child development, whether to provide additional income to kids under 6. Why would you want to do that? Should it be targeted versus the basic income universal idea? It was Dylan Matthews, very, very skilled at taking a complex policy issue, but telling it in a fairly nuanced way and at a length that is really kind of in between your typical kind of newspaper article and actual long-form journalism, right? So I think that's an area that can help explain some of the complexities a little bit. And that was without telling a single family story. That was actually, taking you through and explaining an issue, which I think is a whole another purpose of some of the journalism that I think is effective in this particular area of how, what kind of policy approaches work, right? And what are the challenges when they're being applied in Canada versus Europe versus Scandinavia versus the United States, for example, or Kenya in that case. So, so I think those are some, and so I didn't mean to say like we just need more simplified messages. In fact, I think the next generation of this will have to be more complex because there isn't, I kind of don't, in a way, I don't think the policy implementation world can be simplified into 2 or 3 messages. But I think we need to figure out how to tell a story that's not just about cute kids and their immediate contexts, but about the larger systems that are affecting them, right? Same with public spaces. I mean, I think we have to talk about not just what the kid sees right around them, but what are the economic factors that are make it more likely that a parent might die on the way to work. That's going to affect, that's a public space issue that's going to affect child development, but also kids of all ages, right? So there is a broader context even of that theme.
Hi, I don't really have a question, but I just hearing all this conversation, I thought of, I cover humanitarian stuff, and under that also climate change. So one of the biggest things that's happened is you guys talking about messaging. I just thought of the blue planet phenomenon, which has really swept Europe, and we're banning plastic, hence my reusable, so I just thought maybe can kind of get inspiration from that, perhaps. It's like that is really, really a great kind of series, and maybe there's something in that with ECD as well. But that's all.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that comment.
All right, so thank you, Hiro, very much, and Elana too. And look, I would just say this: it is scientists' job to research. It is educators and communicators' jobs to figure out how to make that digestible. But ultimately, it is our job to figure out the images, the narratives, whether it's in the form of explainers or Catherine Boo's long masterpiece or a single photo or a series of tweets, all of which we as journalists are all in the middle of innovations now in storytelling. Our job is to figure out how to kind of take all this stuff, these innovations in science and policy, and turn them into innovations in journalism. And that's where the conversation is going.